In the darkness of London in 1348, taverns were not places of joy, they were where people came to watch who would be the next to collapse. Wait until you step through the rotting wooden door of a tavern in Cheapside. Don't let the flickering light of tallow candles deceive your eyes. What truly awaits you inside is a deadly mixture. If I told you that every sip of ale you drink may have already touched the lips of someone carrying a deadly disease, that the floor beneath your feet is quietly fermenting with the waste of hundreds before you, and that the meal you call dinner might not even be the meat you think it is, would you still dare to step into that tavern? Are you drinking ale or drinking your own death sentence? Do you have the courage to face the truth behind it all?
With the AI Reconstruction technology, join me as we travel back 700 years to expose the 5 filthiest realities of medieval taverns,
where every sip of ale could be a final farewell. The Communal Drinking Bowl, a transfer station for every disease. When the Black Death turned London into a vast grave, the line between life and death was reduced to a single sip of ale. In the city's wretched taverns, a habit that seemed harmless, sharing drinking vessels, was weaponized, becoming the shortest path for the plague to knock on every door. First look at what sits on that grease-soaked wooden table, blackened by years of filth. These are not the gleaming glass goblets you see in movies. Through the AI Reconstruction, we uncover a far harsher reality, the communal drinking bowl. In cheap medieval taverns, especially in poor working districts and roadside stopping points, the idea of personal drinking vessels barely existed. Patrons drank ale from thick, rough wooden bowls or dark ceramic jugs shared by everyone in the tavern. The rim of the bowl had formed a biological fossil layer, a crusted mixture of dried old ale residue, sweat from scab-covered hands, and rotting food scraps trapped deep within the cracked grain of the wood. These bowls were placed at the center of the table or passed from hand to hand. There were no hygiene rules, no habit of washing between drinkers. On a busy day, the same bowl could touch the lips of dozens of different people. Tavern keepers often owned only a single rag for wiping everything. Wiping the rim of the bowl didn't clean it, it merely swept another layer of dust and filth from the tabletop straight onto the spot where the next customer was about to place their lips. So, you weren't just drinking ale, you were engaging in an indirect kiss with every patron in the tavern that day. Imagine this, just minutes before you sat down, a plague victim, wheezing with each breath, lips bleeding from a raging fever, pressed their mouth against that very same spot. People drank ale out of fear that the Thames was polluted, never realizing that in these wooden bowls, ale itself became a perfect vessel for preserving bacteria. Even so, no one truly had a choice. Clean water was scarce, and cheap ale was the only thing they could drink without dying immediately. It was the product of poverty, ignorance, and the absence of any alternative.
This is exactly why the plague spread through taverns like wildfire. With just a single communal bowl, an entire alley could be wiped out in less than a week.
Pause for just a second and consider this. If it were you, parched with thirst in the middle of a pandemic, would you dare press your lips to the very spot a stranger had just left behind? The dark secrets hidden inside the ale brewing barrels. If the communal bowl was where infection began, then what it contained was the nutrient source that kept the disease alive. Forget any notion of pure beer, because this is the second truth: ale fermented alongside dust and wastewater from behind the tavern. Let's step inside the brewing area to witness a production process truly horrifying. In the 14th century, ale contained no hops, a natural preservative that helps inhibit bacterial growth. This meant ale spoiled extremely quickly and was highly sensitive to its surroundings. And yet, it was brewed under some of the filthiest conditions imaginable. Huge wooden brewing barrels were placed directly beneath roofs made of thatch and dried mud. Over time, the roofs rotted and hollowed out, turning into shelters for rats and birds. Inside the tavern's dark, damp, enclosed space, Flies swarmed straight into the barrels, spiders dropped from the beams, and dust and debris from the rotting roof fell directly onto the surface of the ale. Flies, spiders, and beetles were drawn to the scent of fermentation. They plunged into the ale, struggled briefly, and drowned inside the barrels.
Pause for a moment and ask yourself this. If you left a barrel of water uncovered for days in that environment, what do you think would fall into it?
The answer is everything. Dead insects, wood dust, ash from the hearth, and filthy droplets leaking down from the roof after every rainfall. But the problem didn't end there, because medieval ale often developed a thick, cloudy layer of foam on the surface. Tavern keepers never bothered to skim it off. This became the grotesque protein source that people of the time unknowingly swallowed with every sip of ale. The water used to brew ale was no cleaner. In many poor districts, wells were dug right beside rubbish heaps, latrine pits, or open sewage channels behind the tavern. That water was drawn up, briefly boiled, and then fed straight into the ale brewing process. No one tested it, no one filtered it, and no one asked questions because there was no other choice. Notably, many people at the time believed that the stronger and richer the ale tasted, the better it was.
But that richness often didn't come from careful brewing. It came from things no one could see, already dissolved within it.
If an ale tasted unusually strong, don't be too quick to praise the brewer's skill. What you were likely tasting were the traces of insects' dust and contaminated water silently fermenting together. If you knew that what was fermenting inside that barrel contained far more than you'd ever been told, would you still dare to order another cup? Tavern floors and the sanitation problem of the Middle Ages. But don't focus only on the cup in your hand and forget what's waiting beneath your feet. Because in a tavern in 1348, death didn't arrive only through the mouth, it was also creeping upward from the foul miasma-soaked floor below. The third truth will ensure you never look at a piece of straw the same way again, an entire ocean of human waste quietly fermenting beneath your boots. Imagine stepping through a heavy wooden door to escape the biting cold of London in 1348. Inside, a wave of hot, stagnant air, thick with sour ale, and sweat slams straight into your senses. Flickering torchlight along the walls barely reveals the long, stretching shadows, swallowed by curses, laughter, and the clatter of bowls and plates. In crowded taverns, especially at night, finding the back exit to relieve yourself was almost a luxury. There were no signs, no proper lighting, and no one cared about the inconvenience. This layer of straw was never fully replaced. When the old layer rotted and began to stink, people simply scattered a fresh layer on top. The lowest layer could have been lying there since the previous outbreak, harboring some of the city's oldest and deadliest pathogens. In drunken stupor and darkness, patrons vomited, urinated, and even defecated into the shadows. The layer of straw was there to swallow it all. The floor became a true carpet of waste, where urine vomit and scraps of food merged into a dark liquid sludge lurking beneath a deceptively dry surface. This was a paradise for fleas and rats to thrive. With every step you took, the pressure of your boots forced the liquid waste beneath the floor upward, seeping through the straw and clinging to your footwear and your skin. You carried the tavern's scent home with you, spreading its filth.
And this is what should make anyone shudder. Every step you took inside the tavern wasn't on solid ground.
It was on the rot left behind by hundreds who had stood there before you. No one cleaned the floor at night. No one disinfected it between patrons. The floor was dealt with only by covering the old straw with a fresh layer, temporarily burying the stench, but never removing it. In London, in 1348, the tavern floor was the most silent source of infection, where the Black Death hid itself beneath layers of golden straw. When food became a gamble, amid the choking stench of ammonia rising from the floor, a sudden burst of spices tricks your senses. But don't let hunger lead you into a trap, because behind that aroma lies something far more disturbing. And this is the fourth truth tavern food, a deadly gamble called meat. Ordering a meat pie to go with your ale sounds harmless enough. In the modern imagination, it's a hot, filling meal after a long day of labor. But in the Middle Ages, ordering food in a tavern wasn't a safe habit, it was a risky decision. Ordering a meat pie to go with your ale sounds harmless enough. In the modern imagination, it's a hot, filling meal after a long day of labor. But in the Middle Ages, ordering food in a tavern wasn't a safe habit, it was a risky decision. In an age without refrigeration, meat was both a luxury and extremely quick to spoil. When patrons entered a tavern, they were rarely told where the meat came from, when it had been slaughtered, or how it had been stored. There were no detailed menus, no concept of quality control. Tavern keepers simply served whatever they had that day, and customers either ate it or went hungry. When you ordered a plate of stewed meat, the AI Reconstruction reveals what truly happened behind the tavern's dark kitchen door. This wasn't cooking, it was a sophisticated act of disguising rotten flesh. Most of the meat was never bought fresh. It came from unsold scraps at dusty market stalls, where cuts of flesh hung exposed for days beneath London's sun and smoke. By the time they reached the tavern, the meat had already turned gray, becoming a nursery for millions of fly larvae. Without refrigeration, the meat began to decompose the moment it entered the kitchen. To deal with the overwhelming stench, the cook didn't throw it away. Instead, they reached for their most powerful weapon, heavy spices. Black pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and garlic were layered thickly, coating every strand of rotting flesh. The goal wasn't to enhance flavor, it was to mask decay and make it nearly impossible for diners to tell whether the meat was still edible. That raises an unsettling question: if the spices had to be strong enough to overpower the smell of spoiled meat, just how bad was the meat before it was cooked? In the tavern's heavy darkness, no one asked where the meat came from, and the tavern keeper never volunteered the answer. When beef or mutton disappeared from the market, the meat inside a pie could be anything trapped behind the tavern's latrine, from fat sewer rats to other unidentifiable creatures. You ate not because it tasted good, but because desperation forced you to believe it was food. If you collapsed after the meal from botulinum poisoning or a tapeworm infection, they would simply drag your body onto the floor, scatter a fresh layer of straw over it, and carry on serving the next batch of pies. The piece of meat on your plate might leave you with a stomach ache, but the thick black liquid simmering in that pot was the real death sentence for anyone who dared to taste it. And I'm about to reveal the most horrifying truth of all. The tavern gateway to the Black Death. And here is the final truth, the one that sealed the death sentence for anyone who dared step through that door, the uninvited residents. When taverns became breeding grounds for the Black Death. Outside London in 1348 was a frozen graveyard. But the moment you pushed open a tavern door, a wave of heat thick with human bodies and alcohol wrapped itself around you. You might think you'd found a place of refuge. In reality, you just stepped into a nursery of death. In this cramped space, you were never alone. Thousands of eyes were always watching you from the darkness. Beneath the rotting straw soaked with moisture and human waste, an underground world was stirring. The filthy truth rats didn't just appear occasionally, they lived in the tavern. Whole swarms of fat sewer rats, their fur matted with black sludge and bodily fluids, scurried beneath the feet of the patrons. They weren't afraid of people. They slipped between worn boots, gnawing on the scraps of bone you had just tossed aside. But rats weren't the most dangerous thing. The true agents of death were fleas and lice, tiny creatures almost invisible in the tavern's dim light. In the darkness, fleas weren't confined to the floor. As rats scurried past, they leapt onto table legs, slipped into the cracks of wooden benches, and silently crawled up the folds of your cloak. They didn't need ale, they needed warm blood. And in this cramped tavern, you were the perfect target. Think about it for a moment. In a crowded tavern, where people stand shoulder to shoulder, hugging and leaning on one another, in drunken camaraderie. How long would it take for a single flea to find a new host? The answer, only a few seconds. And the most terrifying part is this: no one went to a tavern expecting to die. Yet countless people carried death out with them when they left. Imagine you're sitting there drinking when suddenly you feel something tiny and ticklish crawling from your ankle up your calf beneath your trousers. At the same time, the squeaking of rats echoes right beneath your seat. What would your first reaction be? By morning, when the sun rises, the tavern floor will be covered with a fresh layer of straw, hiding the traces of the night before. But what has clung to you cannot be buried so easily. Because in London, in 1348, every night of revelry left a mark that could never truly be erased. I've just taken you through the 5 brutal truths hidden behind the taverns of London in 1348. As you step back through the tavern's heavy wooden door, the cold air of the streets closes in around you. The sense of relief you feel in that moment is nothing more than a cruel illusion. The fleas clinging to your cloak, the pathogens from the rotten meat in your stomach, and the filth stuck to the soles of your boots, all are ready to turn your family into the next victims. In this era, the tavern was where death disguised itself as laughter. If you were forced to live in the Middle Ages, would you face hunger out on the streets, or step into a warm tavern where death might already be waiting in the corner? Leave a comment below. Would you step inside, or turn away and walk on? If you don't want these stories to be buried in silence, if you want to keep stepping into rotting taverns, fetid alleyways, and moments history never told you about, subscribe to the channel now. Turn on notifications so you won't miss the next journey, because very soon we'll be returning to another disaster, even darker and more devastating than this one.